Everyone knows about Rolex, the super brand amongst watches. But do you know how the brand got its name? Everyone wants to be on time, creating a demand for watches. While many watchmakers make watches, Rolex decided to stand out with quality and out-of-this-world branding. Today, Rolex is a brand associated with prestige, sophistication, luxury, and success. When you see someone sporting a Rolex watch, your first thought likely is that such a person is classy. This is the successful image the company has built for itself. How did this Swiss company achieve its global relevance? In 2022 alone, Rolex was recognized as the most reputable company in the world, ahead of Ferrari and Rolls-Royce. It is, without a doubt, the most valuable watch brand globally. Its success is heavily linked to the attitude of its founder, Hans Wilsdorf. For many, the name Hans Wilsdorf is not so popular when considering the brand he founded. But as a man who found his interest in watches at a young age and followed through on his passion, his life is worth learning from. Humble beginning. Hans Wilsdorf was born Hans Eberhard Wilhelm Wilsdorf in 1881 in the city of Kulmbach, Bavaria, now a part of Germany. He was the second child of three, and his parents, Anna and Ferdinand Wilsdorf, were Protestants. Anna died while Hans was still quite young, and then his father passed on when he was 12 years old, leaving Hans and his siblings as orphans. Due to the lucrative family iron tools business, which had been owned by Hans' grandfather and then by his father, Hans' family enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle. After his father's death, his uncles sold the business and sent Hans and his siblings to excellent boarding schools, where they received standard education. In school, Hans excelled in maths and languages, gaining strong command in English and French alongside German, his native language. This was very beneficial for him as a businessman. It was also in school that his fascination with watches began. Hans began his professional life as an apprentice for a prominent worldwide pearl exporting company. The lessons Hans learned along the way were quite helpful in his subsequent endeavors. In 1900, Hans Wilsdorf worked in La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland for Kuno Korten. He had a monthly salary of 80 Swiss francs. Kuno Korten was in the business of exporting Swiss pocket watches, and Hans Wilsdorf was in charge of handling correspondence in 3 languages. Kuno Korten was a watchmaker who worked with timepieces of varying qualities and also produced a limited stock of watches from scratch. As part of his job with Kuno Korten, Wilsdorf was accountable for winding hundreds of pocket watches every day and ensuring that all of the timepieces functioned properly. During his time working for Kuno Korten, Wilsdorf received a wealth of expertise on producing many types of watches, which allowed him to gain tremendous insight into the watchmaking industry. This early experience in foreign watch sales would prove extremely valuable to Hans Wilsdorf later in his career. Hans Wilsdorf became familiar with the watch movement maker Egler in Switzerland. Egler was located in the Swiss town of Bienne, which was close by. Egler was producing small watches with lever escapements at the time. These were excellent for wristwatches, which Hans Wilsdorf envisaged as the future of watches despite the widespread disdain that men currently had towards wearing them. Founding Wilsdorf Davis. Hans Wilsdorf relocated to London, England in 1903 to work for yet another watch manufacturer. He subsequently joined forces with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, and the two men created the Wilsdorf Davis Corporation in 1905. Wilsdorf Davis set out to fill a need in the market for reasonably priced, high-quality timepieces. Their business was focused on distributing wristwatches and pocket watches across the entirety of the British Empire. It is important to note that while Hans and Davis were building their watch business, wristwatches were not luxury items for the average man. In fact, they were considered a joke by most people. People felt that watches on the wrist were far too fragile for people to move around with. But Hans did not let this deter him from working on excellent wristwatches. He believed wristwatches would gain popularity and remain functional in the future. He was right. Starting Rolex. Wilsdorf made a trip to Bienne, Switzerland in 1905 to make an order with Egler, which ultimately resulted in the largest order ever made for wristlet watches. From that point until Rolex acquired Egler a century later, the two companies worked together closely. Wilsdorf Davis rose to prominence in the British watch trade in just 3 years, at which point they decided it would be prudent to establish a brand name under which to sell their wares abroad. Having the importer's name on the dials and slasher movements was standard practice at the time. Therefore, this proposal went against industry norm because Hans Wilsdorf envisioned a different future. He once again rejected the standards that were in place at the time. As early as 1908, he trademarked the name Rolex for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited. It is said that while Hans Wilsdorf was riding a horse-drawn double-decker in London, a genie whispered the name Rolex into his ear. This was after a long time searching for a name. Whether you accept that fantastical story, the fact remains that Rolex was a fantastic choice since it is instantly recognizable, can be easily pronounced in any language, and most crucially, was short enough to fit on a dial alongside the importer's name. It is also said that he settled for this name because it sounded luxurious. After he discovered this name, Hans admits that he did not start to inscribe his watches with the name immediately. Rather, he only marked one in every 6 watches and hoped that the watch would get sold. Gradually, he gained confidence and began to mark more watches, and within a decade, all Rolex watches on the market had the Rolex inscription. Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, dispatched a wristwatch to the official watch rating center in Bienne, Switzerland in 1910. When it was returned to Wilsdorf, the watch had been recognized as the world's first wristwatch to be granted the Swiss certificate of chronometric precision. Eventually, Rolex would become known worldwide, but this was just the beginning. In 1914, the British Kew Observatory recognized the superior accuracy of the first Rolex model by issuing a Class A precision certificate. In the past, only the most precise watches, known as maritime chronometers, were awarded this certification. Hans accomplished this before he turned 30. It was an important moment for Rolex. Less than 2 weeks later, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, marking the official start of World War I. Moving headquarters. By 1914, Hans Wilsdorf's London office employed more than 60 people and served as the company's primary export hub. The British government, however, instituted a customs levy of 33.3% on timepieces in 1915. Because of his long-standing professional links to Egler, Hans Wilsdorf was forced to relocate his export operations to his Bienne, Switzerland headquarters. In 1919, Hans Wilsdorf opened the Geneva branch of Rolex as its sole proprietor, and in 1920, the company Montres Rolex SA was formally created in Switzerland. Rolex watches were designed and marketed out of Geneva, while movements were produced in Bienne. After that, Rolex moved its headquarters to Switzerland from England. Hans Wilsdorf and Rolex had a productive year in 1926. In July, he purchased the rights to the winding crown mechanism patented by Paul Perregaux and George Perret. This crown screws into the case, forming an impermeable seal. He filed for the Oyster trademark that very month. In October of that year, he applied for a patent on a watertight watch casing that was based on the Perregaux-Perret mechanism but had other enhancements and alterations of its own. It was in 1926 that Rolex introduced the world to the first timepiece with a watertight and dust-proof case, the Oyster case. In an attempt to time Mercedes Glitz's crossing of the English Channel, Hans Wilsdorf supplied her with a Rolex Oyster the next year. The Rolex Oyster watch survived being submerged for nearly 10 hours in frigid water. A master marketer then secured the front page of the Daily Mail to proclaim Rolex's greatest triumph in watchmaking, thereby launching the concept of the official brand ambassador. A perpetual rotor, self-winding watch mechanism was developed by Rolex in 1931, marking the company's next major achievement. When the watch is on the wearer's wrist, the rotor weans it automatically. Every Rolex watch today is built around the Oyster Perpetual, a combination of the water-resistant Oyster case and the automated perpetual movement. Rolex's growing presence. Hans Wilsdorf and Rolex hit the ground running once he developed the prototype for a watertight, automatically winding wristwatch. Due to the positive feedback from Mercedes Glitz's deployment of the Oyster in the real world, Hans Wilsdorf looked for similar high-profile opportunities to put Rolex timepieces through their paces in hazardous conditions. Hans Wilsdorf, the company's founder, offered free Rolex watches to customers in exchange for their honest opinions on the quality and functionality of the timepieces. Sir Malcolm Campbell, who drove the Bluebird to a land speed record of more than 300 miles per hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah in 1933, also wore a Rolex Oyster watch on that mission. In 1945, Hans Wilsdorf's firm celebrated its 40th anniversary, so he did what he knew best. He introduced a new Rolex model, the Datejust. Rather than using a normal pointer hand, the Rolex Datejust was the first wrist chronometer to feature a dial window showing the current date. In addition, a brand new bracelet known as the Jubilee was introduced. The Datejust is now one of Rolex's most recognizable timepieces, and the Jubilee bracelet is as indispensable as it was when it was first introduced. After World War II, Hans Wilsdorf presented war heroes with commemorative Rolex watches. General Henry Gizen, Chief of Staff for the Swiss Army during World War II, received the 50,000th Rolex, a yellow-gold Oyster Perpetual, to be formally certified as a Swiss chronometer in 1946. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister for the duration of World War II, received the 100,000th Rolex chronometer, a rose gold Datejust, as a gift in 1948. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War II, received the 150,000th Rolex chronometer, a yellow gold Datejust, in 1951. In the 1950s, Rolex introduced many new models to its lineup, each one a specialized instrument for a different task. Hans Wilsdorf, true to habit, supplied Rolexes to the British Mount Everest expedition in 1953. Wilsdorf introduced the Rolex Explorer that same year to celebrate Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary's historic summit. In the same year, 1953, the Submariner was introduced as the first diving watch to be water-resistant to 100 meters, 330 feet, for use by skin divers and early scuba divers. The Rolex GMT Master, originally made for Pan American pilots to keep track of multiple time zones, was introduced in 1955. In 1956, Rolex released the anti-magnetic Milgauss watch for scientists and the ultra-luxurious Day-Date President watch for world leaders. In 1957, the Lady Datejust, Rolex's timepiece for women featuring a date window, was introduced. Hans Wilsdorf's legacy. When his loving wife Florence died in 1944, grief struck the Rolex creator. He donated his entire investment in Rolex to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation the following year. The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, which has owned and operated Rolex from the company's inception, continues to do so today and makes substantial undisclosed contributions to charity. Bertha Betty Mettler, Hans Wilsdorf's second wife, supposedly had problems reading the dial's small date window, which inspired him to create the Cyclops magnification lens. Since its debut on the date, just in 1953, the Cyclops has become integral to virtually every Rolex watch featuring a date display till date. Hans Wilsdorf passed on in 1960. He was more than just a businessman with foresight. He was a watchmaker and a creative thinker who established the foundational technical and aesthetic aspects of Rolex watches and paved the road for their enduring success. His never-ending pursuit of excellence was matched by an equally boundless spirit of charity and an unshakable trust in the potential of human beings in their ability to innovate and overcome obstacles. Always kind and courageous, Hans Wilsdorf welcomed a challenge and inspired those around him to do the same. Hans Wilsdorf was a visionary who, thanks to his expertise in watchmaking, entrepreneurial drive, and ability to think outside the box, gave Rolex watches its distinctive technological and aesthetic DNA and paved the way for the company's continued success. In addition to his never-ending pursuit of excellence, he possessed an unwavering generosity and faith in the potential of human beings, especially in our ability to invent and conquer. Hans Wilsdorf was a selfless individual who inspired people to give their all and was always up for a personal challenge. For more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.